people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Okay, we'll start with this. Eddie Hearn has said that conversations have taken place for Callum Smith to take on either David Benavidez or David Morrell next. I like either of those fights for Callum, both challenging in their own way. We know that the weekend of the Callum Smith versus Joshua Buatsi fight in Saudi, David Benavidez was there very briefly, and he touched on the potentiality of a Callum Smith fight in the interim. Should Dimitri Bivol and Artur Beterbiev run it back one more time, he could keep busy with Callum Smith, theoretically. We also know that David Morrell is coming off his first professional loss to David Benavidez. I feel like David Morrell needs a fight with Callum more than David Benavidez.
Why?
But David Benavidez is already WBA and WBC interim champion. Fighting Callum is just more of the same for David. He'd be in the exact same position. Whereas David Morrell, who's coming off his first professional loss, needs to get back in contention.
World title contention.
Being a Cuban fighter in the United States doesn't exactly guarantee David Morrell a built-in fan base like it does for, say, a Mexican fighter or a Puerto Rican fighter.
No.
The very general sense, opportunities for a Cuban in the United States in a boxing ring are far and few, especially now that he's coming off his first professional loss to David Benavidez. Thus, if a door opens and a Callum Smith fight is on the other side of it, he needs to jump all over that. I don't think David Morrell was making much money with the fights that he was having already. I don't think he made much money from the David Benavidez fight, the David Benavidez loss. Thus, a Callum Smith fight presents a unique opportunity for David Morrell coming off this loss to make a decent-sized purse in a meaningful fight that will get you somewhere. You're not just staying busy, you'd get back into world title contention. And thus, I think David Morrell needs this fight a lot more than David Benavidez does.
David Benavidez.
For David, it's a chance to keep busy, make some money, and further legitimize himself as a light heavyweight because he still has some catching up to do. Callum Smith has been at this weight a lot longer than David Benavidez, and I'd say that he has at least one better win at this weight than David. David beat David Morrell, who did next to nothing at this weight, whereas Callum beat Joshua Buatsi, who's never been anything else.
Anywhere else.
Bonafide light heavyweight. David beating David is two guys who moved up from 168 up to 175. That doesn't say more than Callum beating unbeaten Joshua Buatsi, a standout amateur and unbeaten as a professional going in. So for David Benavidez, this is a chance to further legitimize himself at this weight.
Who's putting it on?
Eddie Hearn says that conversations have taken place for either of those fights, but who's supposed to be paying for it? The PBC? Matchroom? Turkey?
Who's putting it on?
Because depending on who's offering to pay for these fights, that determines the likelihood of any of them actually happening. If it's Turkey, then it's the most bang for your buck at this weight. But if it's either Matchroom or the PBC, it could turn into a haggling situation.
You want it on your side, they want it on theirs.
David Benavidez versus Callum Smith is an interesting matchup because in the past, the kind of guys that give Callum problems are the guys who crowd him mid-range to inside. Aggressive fighters, volume punchers, and that's what David Benavidez is.
A pressure guy.
Like John Ryder was a pressure guy, Artur Beterbiev was a pressure guy. Canelo's not necessarily a pressure fighter, but he can mimic one to put the other guy under pressure and put him on his back foot.
That's what disarms Callum, when you back him off and put him on his back foot.
So that is an interesting component, though at the same time, David Benavidez's defense, when coming forward, whether you're talking about the Ronald Gavril fight years ago or the more recent David Morrell fight years later, coming forward, he's not necessarily slippery. He's not hard to find or hard to hit.
Yeah, he can be caught.
David Morrell caught him a couple of times, and I happen to think at this weight, Callum Smith cracks harder than a David Morrell. The assignment for David Benavidez is smothering Callum Smith and bullying him on the inside, whereas for Callum, he's got to create a bit of space, a bit of distance to get those long arms out and generate power.
And David Morrell?
That fight between him and Callum is a little harder to imagine because David Morrell is a boxer puncher, though still a bit on the green side. Think about it. Who's the best guy this guy beat at 168?
Best fighter.
And at 175, he's done even less. All you did was outpoint Radovanje Kalajdzic and look human while you did it, then lose to David Benavidez. So it's a little harder to imagine how he would handle a more proven fighter, more proven all around, in Callum Smith, because Callum was a champion at 168, and he's been at this weight a lot longer than David Morrell.
He's more proven all around.
I like either of these fights in the interim, while the potentiality of a Beterbiev versus Bivol trilogy looms. The other boys gotta fight. They gotta keep busy.
Can't just sit at home, waiting by the phone, doing nothing, collecting ring rust.
Not a good idea. Now, as it pertains to the Beterbiev versus Bivol trilogy, Eddie Hearn says Turki El Sheikh is likely to want that next.
Eddie Hearn told Boxing Scene on Friday that reports of Matchroom and PBC negotiating a fight between undisputed light heavyweight champion Dmitry Bivol and David Benavidez are completely false. Although Bivol is a Matchroom fighter, the promoter said that the Russian's next move will be dictated by His Excellency Turki El Sheikh, because he gave him all the opportunities. He fought Lyndon Arthur, he fought another defense over there against Malik Zanad, and then he fought Artur Beterbiev twice. Don't forget that the first fight was razor thin, and Turki said, I want to see that again.
And to be fair to him, he made it happen in 4 months. Unbelievable. The second fight was also close, and I think he'll say to Beterbiev that you will get your shot.
So where did these reports of a Benavidez versus Bivol fight come from?
Well, the first I heard of it was from veteran boxing scribe Julius Julianus. And then I saw Samson Lukowicz on the Bernardo Pilati podcast mention sending email correspondence to Bivol's manager, preliminary conversations, but nothing far along.
Nothing close to final.
And nothing that could impede this trilogy. They should run it back because it's a brilliant fight. We also love Benavidez against Bivol, but for me, it will be the trilogy next. The problem for Beterbiev is that Bivol is going to get better, so we're very confident going into that fight.
Says Eddie Hearn.
A third Beterbiev versus Bivol matchup could open an opportunity for another Matchroom light heavyweight in Callum Smith to face David Benavidez. Smith impressively outpointed previously unbeaten Joshua Buatsi in a grueling fight on the undercard of Bivol versus Beterbiev's rematch to re-establish himself as a major player in the light heavyweight division. We've had some conversations around Benavidez versus Smith and around Callum Smith versus David Morrell as well, said Hearn. I mean, Callum Smith's in a really good position, you know. He's mandatory via the WBO. He won't be called just yet, but he's the interim world champion, just had a great win against Buatsi. Unfortunately, when you become undisputed like Bivol, all of these mandatories swing around. They've got one with the IBF, they've got Benavidez, they've got Callum Smith, so yeah, I think the belts will free up over the next 12 months.
That means that even if Artur Beterbiev is sure to get another crack at the apple, it may not be for undisputed.
Both the red belt and the green one may become vacant as a result. What I think would be the ideal scenario is if you set up a light heavyweight clash, a light heavyweight bonanza,
where Artur Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol are in the main event, Callum Smith and David Benavidez are in the co-main event, and on the undercard, you get David Morrell versus Michael Eifert.
Who?
Germany's own Michael Eifert, unbeaten, who became the mandatory challenger long before we got here. Before Callum Smith and before David Benavidez, Michael Eifert was the IBF's mandatory challenger.
He was there before any of them, so that needs to be respected. The ideal scenario for me is a card that allows all these boys to get out there, mix it up with each other for full titles or not, keep them busy, keep them active.
Keep them fighting so we can stay entertained.
You think about Michael Eifert, whether his next fight is for the full title or not, you're not going to really make any money taking that red belt back to Germany with you. The real money is on the dance floor, on the world stage. Whether you're opposite the ring David Morrell or David Benavidez.
The real money is on the world stage.
And obviously, I could go for a Callum Smith versus David Benavidez fight, whether it's for the green belt or not.
It's for the interim.
I could go for that. The potentiality of a trilogy between Dimitri and Artur. The first fight really was razor thin. I saw a lot of people saying they thought Dimitri Bivol won, but I felt like the judges got it right. Artur did enough for me in my view.
Did enough in the first one. Dimitri obviously did enough in the second. The third will be the tiebreaker, the rubber match.
This trilogy is warranted. It absolutely is. Now, forecasting the outcomes of these two fights has not been easy. I'm 0-2. At first, I thought Dimitri would win their initial meeting, and Artur won. Then I thought Artur would win the rematch, and Dimitri won.
So who do you think is going to win a trilogy?
My hierarchy of thought has not serviced me well when it comes to these two particular fighters, but what stands out is that it's not going to get easier for Artur, and if I was right about anything, is that he wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to be different from the first fight into the second. Whatever you saw in the first fight, that's what you'd see in a rematch, and I feel like that's what we saw. It's Dimitri that changed, because Dimitri was the one that had to.
Had to adjust.
Rematches are often won by the fighter who can change, the fighter who can adjust, and that was really Dimitri more than Artur, because Dimitri's the cerebral one, Artur's a pressure guy. And what do I say all the time? Pressure guys really don't change much from one fight to the next.
I don't expect that to be different in a trilogy, and tack on that this is a much quicker turnaround of fights than what Artur Beterbiev is used to. There are sometimes very long gaps, long stretches of inactivity in between some of Artur's fights in previous years, whereas now he's being forced to fight more frequently, go into a camp more frequently, and maybe for a guy his age, that makes it more difficult to get ready.
The edge goes to Dimitri Bivol to outpoint Artur Beterbiev in a third fight, if and when a third fight happens.
I like Dimitri on points, but I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. That's how I see it.
Heavy is the head that wears the crown as the mandatories are piling up. Dimitri Bivol, with all the belts or without them, is still the man to beat at this weight.
If one or some of the alphabet titles he currently holds go to other fighters, he's still the king of this division. He's still the man to beat.
What you want to do is prove you're the best at this weight. That's the guy you gotta go through.
Elsewhere in the world of boxing, on the more business end of the spectrum,
The UFC will reportedly do everything in their power to get a Netflix deal. Once their contract with ESPN expires at the end of the year, UFC is allegedly having issues with ESPN's technology, while ESPN isn't happy with pay-per-view numbers being way down.
I thought you said this was boxing related.
It is, if you will give me a second to get to that. That bit of intel comes to us by way of the New York Post via Happy Punch. How this might be relevant to a boxing conversation is that Toprank's deal with ESPN is set to be up this year too. But if the UFC is indefinitely leaving, which we've talked about, ESPN needs to fill the void with something.
What?
I think there's a correlation between UFC pay-per-view numbers being weighed down and Dana White endeavoring into the world of boxing with Turkey El Sheikh's help.
Of course.
For years, we heard about how Dana White would like to get into boxing with his Zuffa boxing, but it was to no avail. Now, with Turkey's assistance, he stands a much, much better chance. But I find it interesting that all of this is happening around the time that UFC buys it down, and they have a lack of star power.
Because I've been hearing that too. Long gone are the days of a Ronda Rousey or a Conor McGregor.
Another fighter with their same star power, drawing power, has not come into the spotlight since they stepped out.
Just a lot of Dagestani guys with big beards.
Gripes about their methodology, the way they fight versus what entertainment value they provide, or what entertainment value they don't provide. I've been hearing this and that on the outskirts.
Simultaneously, I've been hearing this and that about Dana White's TKO Boxing League. Him, Turkey, Nick Khan. that they might land on ESPN, which I don't think is an adequate substitute for Top Rank and Top Rank Boxing, what is an established brand versus a fledgling boxing league.
If you have a stable of fighters and they're fighting for some kind of in-house belt, some kind of in-house title, as opposed to the 4 major titles all the other boxers are boxing for, you're basically your own league, your own AAA league. And their relationship to the rest of the sport of boxing would be tantamount to the AAA league's relationship to Major League Baseball. And thus, when you look at it that way, TKO Boxing, irrespective of who's running it, isn't really a substitute for Top Rank Boxing. That if what the people at ESPN are thinking is they can swap them out.
That's not an even trade.
So many people with so many wild ideas about what TKO would do to the rest of the boxing landscape, that they were going to run everybody out and put everybody out of business. Turkey LL Sheikh recently addressed all of those wild speculations, saying this TKO Boxing project isn't against anyone, not against the commission, not against the promoters. We will still see the 4 belts and the commission and the promoters.
Told ya. In the days that have followed the announcement of this TKO Boxing League, a lot of people with a lot of ulterior motives, a lot of agendas, have been putting out a lot of wild ideas that I felt were off base. Told ya.
Now, I've heard Eddie Hearn say on more than one occasion that this TKO Boxing League could end up landing on ESPN, but like I said, TKO is not an adequate substitute for an established brand in boxing.
They're not an adequate substitute for Top Rank. Here's an example. Michaela Mayer and Sandy Ryan brought in close to 1 million viewers to ESPN. It was a women's boxing match that did that.
A relatively inexpensive one at that. I don't think you turn around, swap them out for this TKO Boxing League, and bring in that same kind of viewership. No, I don't think that's how it goes down. I think for ESPN, ideally, if the UFC is set to leave you for Netflix,
you fill the void they leave behind with TKO, but stay on board with Top Rank.
I think for ESPN, that would be the ideal way to do it. When UFC leaves, they're going to leave behind a void. You can fill it with TKO and keep Top Rank and the established audience you already have.
You know, TKO Boxing League ain't gonna cost you what UFC's been costing you. So if they leave, that frees up some money.
And you can use that surplus of capital to re-up with Top Rank and sprinkle a little bit over this TKO Boxing League.
That's why I keep saying the matter between Top Rank and ESPN is not settled, since they're set to lose the UFC.
If you lose both the UFC and Top Rank, what are you left with? A fledgling boxing promotion that most boxing fans aren't even familiar with yet.
It's not an even trade.
So I wouldn't jump to conclusions about the future of Top Rank on this platform like so many others already have just yet. The matter is not settled.
The final card of their existing deal is set to go down in July, and a lot can happen between now and July.
So we'll wait and see what happens.